Hat, sunglasses, Pepsi, notes, sources, thick skin. Check. You already know. Let's go. Welcome to Gold and Blue today, everybody. This is a college football channel. So if you like college football, hit the like and subscribe button. It's that simple. Also, send gear to represent your team and be a part of my background forever. All you have to do is send it to P.O. Box 360, Liberty, South Carolina 29657. This is a fact that we all absolutely know. The playoff committee loves the SEC. It is what it is. Playoffs are on ESPN. ESPN has a lucrative TV deal with the SEC, and I don't care what schools or teams each representative in the playoff committee represents. They all answer to the same company, ESPN. I mean, it's a business deal, okay? It is what it is. I'm not going to call it cheating. It's business, okay? So they are going to favor the SEC. And I do think that there's a conceivable way that the SEC not only puts 2 teams in, but puts 3 teams in. In fact, I think there's a high likelihood that they put 2 teams in, but there's a smaller likelihood that they could put 3 teams in, but the chances are still there. Here's what needs to happen for the SEC to put 3 teams in the playoffs. The first thing we'll talk about is the SEC. We have 3 teams, the 3 teams that I think could go, but there's 2 other teams I'm going to mention that you just can't leave out because you never know. First one, Georgia. Of course, they're 9-0. I do think Georgia finishes the regular season 12-0. They do have some tough games though. At Mississippi State, ESPN gives them an 84.8% chance of winning that game. That's going to be a tough road game, but Georgia is the better team. I do expect them to beat Mississippi State. After that, at number 24, Kentucky, ESPN gives them a 90.7% chance of winning that game. Again, Georgia the better team, but it will be a tough road game. I think Georgia wins that game. Then a home game against Georgia Tech, ESPN gives them 98.7% chance of winning that game. I think Georgia wins that game easily. So Georgia finishes the regular season undefeated, but they go on to the SEC championship and lose to either LSU, Ole Miss, or Alabama. Personally, I think whoever wins the SEC championship game gets into the playoffs no matter what. Oh, but Georgia will kill anybody out of the West. LSU, Ole Miss, or Alabama. Understand that. But we were all saying the same thing last year. Georgia's going to kill Alabama. And Georgia just did not look like the same team. It looked like they laid down for Alabama. The same thing could happen this year. They could lay down for either LSU, Alabama, or Ole Miss just to get them to the playoffs. Georgia's like, hey, we know we're getting to the playoffs. We're going to do the bidding of the SEC and ESPN. We're going to lay down and allow yet another team to get into the playoffs. I'm telling you, it's very, very possible. The next team that factors into this equation is Tennessee. Tennessee is now 8-1. Their only loss on the road to Georgia. Remaining games, Missouri at home. ESPN gives them a 92.8% chance of winning. Missouri has been a tricky team, but I expect Tennessee to win that game. After that, a tricky road trip to South Carolina. ESPN gives them a chance of 86.4% chance of winning that game. I think Tennessee is the better team, but I think that's going to be a tougher game than people realize. However, I think Tennessee comes out with the win. And after that, at Vanderbilt, ESPN gives them a 95.9% chance of winning that game. And I do think Tennessee beats Vanderbilt on the road, and Tennessee could finish the regular season 11-1. And if that happens, Tennessee will make the playoffs. And finally, the SEC West. The first team, number 7, LSU. Right now, they're 7-2. Great wins over Ole Miss and Alabama. Remaining schedule at Arkansas. ESPN gives them a 72.4% chance of winning that game. Tricky road game, but I think LSU can win that game. UAB at home. ESPN gives them a 90.8% chance of winning that game. Yes, I think LSU wins that game. Then at Texas A&M, ESPN gives them a 70.2% chance of winning that game. And yes, I think LSU wins that game as well. So if LSU wins out and beats Georgia in the SEC championship game, LSU is also in the playoffs. So let's talk about the 2 other teams that have a chance here. Number 9, Alabama. They're 7-2. Losses to Tennessee and LSU. Remaining games at number 11, Ole Miss. ESPN gives them a 75.3% chance of winning that game. Ole Miss could beat Alabama, but Alabama could also beat Ole Miss. I think that's a coin flip game. After that, FCS Austin Peay. ESPN gives them a 99.7% chance of winning that game. I think that's a gimme game. And then finally, the rivalry game against Auburn. ESPN gives them a 95.7% chance of winning that game. I do think Alabama wins that game, but it is a rivalry game, so you never know. So the way Alabama can still make the playoffs is, number 1, they win out, but LSU has to lose 2 more games because LSU does hold the tiebreaker over Alabama, and Alabama does have 2 losses in the SEC. So LSU needs 3 losses in the SEC, and right now they only have 1. So Alabama needs them to lose twice, and then Alabama beats Georgia in the SEC championship game. This one I don't think happens at all. I do not think that LSU loses 2 more games. Their schedule is too easy for that. So finally, the last contender contestant in the SEC West, and that's Ole Miss. Ole Miss is 8-1. Their only loss to LSU. Remaining games, number 9, Alabama. ESPN gives them just a 24.7% chance of winning this game. If this was a road game, I would say not going to happen. Alabama wins, but it is a home game. And as shaky as Ole Miss has looked, Alabama has looked even shakier on the road. Ole Miss has a chance to win this game. After that, at Arkansas, ESPN gives them a 66.8% chance of winning that game. I actually think this is the game that Ole Miss has the highest likelihood of losing, just because they've been terrible on the road. And then finally, the rivalry game against Mississippi State, ESPN gives them a 66% chance of winning this game. This is a rivalry game. Mississippi State is a good team. It's a losable game for Ole Miss. This game being at home, I do think Ole Miss wins this game. So how does Ole Miss get into the playoffs? Well, first of all, they have to win out, and then they also need LSU to lose one more game in the SEC. Because remember, LSU, even though they're 7-2, they only have one loss in the SEC, and they do own the tiebreaker over Ole Miss. So Ole Miss needs them to lose one more SEC game in order for Ole Miss to have a chance to get to the SEC championship. And then, of course, Ole Miss would have to beat Georgia in the SEC championship game to get into the playoffs. So the highest likelihood is LSU. Georgia wins out, loses to LSU in the SEC championship game, and Tennessee wins out. That gives the SEC a chance to get 3 teams in. But some other things need to happen. Now, first off, for the Big Ten, I think the Big Ten is getting to the playoffs. The winner of the Michigan-Ohio State game, all they have to do is win the Big Ten championship game, and they're in, because the chances of either of these 2 teams losing before that showdown, not very high. For Michigan, they get Nebraska at home. ESPN gives them a 97% chance of winning that game, and I do think they win that game. Then they get number 21 Illinois. ESPN gives them an 89.4% chance of winning that game, and I do think Michigan wins that game as well. For Ohio State, they get Indiana at home. ESPN gives them a 98.4% chance of winning that game. I think Ohio State obliterates Indiana. But then a tricky road test at Maryland. ESPN gives them an 87.7% chance of winning that game. Maryland is terrible on the road, but they're actually pretty good at home. So keep your eyes on that game. It could trip up Ohio State. But even if Ohio State were to lose to Maryland, still beat Michigan, win the Big Ten championship, I think the Big Ten is in the playoffs no matter what. Whether it's an undefeated champion or a one-loss champion, the Big Ten gets in. So really, they're a non-factor in all this. Next up, the Big 12, and it's all about TCU. TCU is 9-0. Remaining schedule, at number 18, Texas. ESPN gives them just a 27% chance of winning that game. Texas is actually favored. TCU could most definitely lose that game. After that, at Baylor, ESPN gives them just a 42.8% chance of winning that game. Again, TCU could go on the road and lose to Baylor. Finally, Iowa State at home. ESPN gives them a 70.2% chance of winning that game, and I do think TCU wins that game. But the bottom line is, if the Big 12 champ has at least one loss, then the Big 12 could be left out because of the SEC and the Big 10. So TCU is a major factor as far as the SEC possibly getting 3 teams in. Next conference is the ACC. The first team is number 10, Clemson. They're 8-1, and yes, I do think they would be a factor in this. Remaining games, Louisville at home. ESPN gives them a 76.2% chance of winning this game. Louisville is a much improved team, but it's in Death Valley. I have Clemson winning that game. Then a home game against Miami, Florida. ESPN gives them a 92% chance of winning that game. I think Clemson mops the floor with Miami. Sorry, Canes fans. And then finally, South Carolina at home. South Carolina looking better. ESPN gives Clemson an 87.7% chance of winning this game. And yes, since it's in Death Valley, I think Clemson wins this game. So yes, I think Clemson finishes the regular season with one loss. It's North Carolina you have to keep your eyes on. Number 15, North Carolina, they're 8-1. They have some tough games though. At Wake Forest, ESPN gives them a 45.8% chance of winning the game, and I do think North Carolina loses to Wake Forest. Wake Forest is a good team, and North Carolina hasn't been tested. After that, Georgia Tech at home. ESPN gives them an 87.5% chance of winning that game. I think they do win that game. And then finally, the rivalry game, number 16, NC State. ESPN gives them a 59.1% chance of winning that game, and I think it being at home gives North Carolina the edge, and I do think that they beat NC State. So whether they lose to Wake Forest or NC State, I think North Carolina gets into the ACC championship with 2 losses because they have the tiebreaker over Duke. So if North Carolina can go into the ACC championship game and beat Clemson, and there's a 2-loss ACC champion, and the ACC is eliminated. But even if Clemson wins out and there's a 1-loss ACC champ, that blowout loss to Notre Dame could be enough to allow the SEC to get 3 teams anyways. And then there's the Pac-12. The Pac-12 poses the biggest threat as far as blowing up this possible scenario. You have 3 teams with 1 loss. The first team, number 6, Oregon, 8-1. They do have some tough games. Number 25, Washington. ESPN gives them a 77.2% chance of winning that game. That's a rivalry game. but it's a home game, very winnable. Number 13, Utah at home. ESPN gives them a 55.3% chance of winning that game. Again, a tough game, but it is at home. Winnable game. And then finally, the rivalry game at Oregon State. ESPN gives them a 67.5% chance of winning that game. That one's kind of surprising that ESPN is giving them a higher chance of beating Oregon State on the road rather than Utah at home. Oregon State is better than people realize. They almost beat USC at home. It is very possible for Oregon State to beat Oregon. So Oregon could lose another game, still win the Pac-12 championship, and the Pac-12 is out because they have a 2-loss champion. Next team, number 8, USC, 8-1 also. Next game, Colorado. ESPN gives them a 98% chance of winning that game. Then a rivalry game at number 12, UCLA. ESPN does give them the edge, 53.9% chance to win that game. That is a very losable game. After that, number 20, Notre Dame at home, another rivalry game, and ESPN gives them a 64.2% chance of winning that game. Let's say that USC beats UCLA, so it knocks them out, but loses to Notre Dame, and then USC goes on to beat Oregon in the Pac-12 championship game. Well, that would give you a 2-loss Pac-12 champion. And finally, there's number 12, UCLA. They also factor into this. They're 8-1. Remaining schedule, Arizona at home. ESPN gives them an 88.3% chance of winning that game, and yes, UCLA wins that game. Next game, the rivalry game at home, number 8, USC. ESPN gives them just a 46.1% chance of winning that game. They're favoring USC. I think that's a winnable game for UCLA, though. And then finally, at Cal, ESPN gives them a 72.1% chance of winning that game. So for UCLA, let's say they lose to USC, so that would eliminate them immediately. They're not even getting to the Pac-12 championship, so they're not a threat at all. Or they beat USC, but they lose to a 2-loss Oregon. Once again, that would allow the Pac-12 to have a 2-loss champ, which is very favorable for this scenario. Bottom line is, the SEC needs a 2-loss Pac-12 champ. The ACC, I don't know if they're relevant, but a 2-loss ACC champ, that would also help. But even if Clemson wins with 1 loss, they still might miss it. Then they also need at least a 1-loss Big 12 champ as well. A 2-loss Big 12 champ would be preferred, but even a 1-loss Big 12 champ could allow for this scenario to happen as far as 3 SEC teams to get into the playoffs. So really, the biggest thing that people argue as far as this not happening is nobody's going to beat Georgia in the SEC championship. I would agree with that if you go by who's better, but Georgia laid a precedent last year. I don't care who you are. It looked like Georgia laid down for Alabama last year. Who's to say you're not going to lay down for whoever wins the SEC West this year as well, just to get one more SEC team in the playoffs? I'm telling you, this is more doable than people realize. Y'all let me know in the comments section, how likely do you think it is that the SEC gets 3 teams, not 2 teams, because I think that's actually happening as long as Tennessee wins out, but 3 teams into the playoffs? And how do you see the rest of these conference championships playing out? Who do you have winning each conference with how many losses? That's all I got for this show. Like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you on my next show.